goes from Boston to New York to Washington. You know, Europe is so much further ahead with train services, but we had an opportunity to work on the design of this new service a few years ago. The request was to design the interior of the coaches. You know, the sort of Amtrak came to us and said, we're going to do this new service, would you design the inside of the train for us? And our first response, of course, was to try and do a little study of what it's like to use a train service. We sent our design team out with these cards that were written out by our human factors folks, which they asked to take out every few minutes and then work through the experience. In this case, be hungry, try to find something to eat, causes you to look for refreshment on the train. And so lots of questions like that. But what emerged was that the journey, if you think about it holistically, is so much more than just the train interior. You know, initially you have to think about how people learn about the service and how they plan it. You know, is this on the web or people to people, or do they find out about it through advertising? There's lots of communication design and information design that goes into that learning process. Then they want to find out about the timetable, and they want to move from wherever their destination starts, or their starting point, to arrive at the station. How do they get their way into the station and find the right platform and know which train they're going to be traveling on, whether it's on time or late, and all those other things. So all those things have happened before we've ever got to the point of getting onto the train. In fact, they got to the ticketing as well. They might get that in advance, or they might get it as they arrive in the station itself. And then they wait for the train. So what's the provision, the service provision for making it comfortable, enjoyable to be waiting for the train, the waiting room, the refreshments and so on. And then at last, we board the train. So only after all those steps do we need to think about the design of the train itself, and then what it's like to ride on it. And similarly, when we come to the other end, you know, when we're arriving, what's that experience? How do we know where we go when we get off? Where are we going to go as our next destination? What are the transport links to other parts of the service? So by thinking of this as a whole journey, rather than just design of a train, we actually got the project, which was nice. But at the same time, they only let us design the train. Fran Samilionis is the service practice lead for us in IDEO in London. But when she was in San Francisco, she did a project about designing an online bank. And I thought that would be an interesting example of a service that you might like to hear about. So I have her interviewed here talking about it.
In service design, it's not just about getting in tune with the customer. We have to consider all the other different stakeholders in the mix. So that could be the business perspective, the brand perspective, the technology, the operations, the relationship between the business and competition, or industry commentators. There are so many different stakeholders. And that really what we need to do is use the same sort of empathic techniques that we use to understand customers to understand those different perspectives. Juniper were an online bank. What they really needed was some clarity and a point of view about what they could offer as a service provider. One of the techniques that we used was to get people to draw their money. We had already asked them to sort of walk us around their house or their work and identify things that they associated with money. So they were already in that sort of frame, in the right sort of frame of mind. But what we wanted to do was sort of help them flip to the other side of the brain and express more emotion, the emotional connection with money. We started with a sort of broad range of observations. And from those observations, developing insights, and then from those insights, crafting those insights into a framework. At some point, that framework became a sort of 2x2 of the sort of psychographics of consumers. And the dimensions of that framework were short-term to long-term view, and low engagement to high engagement with managing money. That framework in itself became very powerful as a decision tool within Juniper, Because not only did it give them a perspective on who their potential customers might be and on what their behaviours and their needs might be, but we could start to take a look at the competition and who the competition were going after and how they were addressing these customer needs. And from that framework, you can start to generate, hundreds of ideas. And then not just leave those ideas sort of floating around in the ether, but ground them very quickly into prototypes. At many different levels and fidelities, but through iterative prototyping, you work towards the most effective solution.
So I think one of the things that's interesting when you think about this sort of journey, the full experience, is how do you prototype it? Because, the prototyping techniques that we think of historically for design, are model making for physical stuff, and then there's lots of prototyping techniques for technology like Macromind and Flash and things like that. But when you put all these things together, and there's elements from architecture, from physical design, from electronic technology, from software, how do you actually prototype an idea for a service? And it seems that really it's about storytelling. It's about narrative. And we can use sort of short, sketchy kind of things like enactments, play acting, or we can do things that people who are making cartoons do, like storyboards or sketches that show a sequence of events, or we can use a moving media like video or film. And as my last example, I wanted to show you a piece of work for the Intel, where we're looking at the future of ultra-mobile PCs. And so this is a story about using a service for navigation. There's a Chinese businessman who's arrived in the States that has to find his way around. And this is the provision of the service for that.
听音乐，贝多芬。行走，主要景点。
歌剧院在前方，自然历史博物馆在左边。 AlphaTech 在左边，
打开连结。
AlphaTech 是专门从事计算机。注意，前面路口不能进入。
找另外一条路。打电话，李先生。
喂，
这是老王。 我在路上，交通有点阻塞，我很快就到。
So there, the storytelling is fairly sophisticated filmmaking, but it can be very rough and ready, at the beginning of a project as well. But you notice this combination of all the sort of different kinds of elements, like there's a little physical design for a telephone thing, which was just a cylinder of metal, actually, a very simple model. But it did communicate the idea of an advanced futures kinds of telephone headset. Then there was the experience of being a foreigner in a different culture, which was quite well communicated by the fact that you couldn't understand anything anybody said. And then there was the fact that all that interaction stuff was done in After Effects after the movie, sort of just added to tell the story of how you could explain how to get things in a navigational system that's more sophisticated and new looking than the ones we find today. So the new design intentions really communicated through some narrative, in this case a more sophisticated filmmaking kind of narrative. So I think, if I look at what I've tried to say this morning, it's really that service design needs to be thought of as completely holistic experiences, and that if we focus on trying to understand the people who may use the service and also ways of prototyping it that are appropriate for the different elements or touch points in the service, perhaps we're likely to succeed. Thanks very much.